Welcome to another episode of Systematic Geekology. This is a space where we seek to create and cultivate healthy conversations between those things we geek out on and the philosophical and theological questions that often arise out of our fandoms. Like, what does it mean to be human? What makes a hero? What makes a villain? How do the stories and narratives we geek out on shape how we live in the world? We are your priest to the geeks. We aren't all ordained, but we see ourselves as mediators at the intersection of geek culture and going deeper in our faith. We don't always have to agree, but we do respect each other, and we see everyone as a beloved child of God. Everyone geeks out on something, so come geek out with us and enjoy the show.
You're listening to an Anazal Ministries podcast.
Hello, fellow geekologists. Welcome to another episode of Systematic Geekology. We're glad you could be a part of this episode. I'm super stoked that you're here. We are your priest to the geeks. You heard the intro before this episode where we share that this is not a bait and switch. We are geeks who love our fandom and love all these things that we geek out on, but we also like to go deep into these things that we geek out on, and like we're what you like, you just go deeper into those things that we geek out on and get to the philosophical and theological things that we love. So we're glad that you're here, and this particular episode is an episode where we are the primarily religion. We're going to explore the religions within our fandom, and it's no secret that your host, Will Rose, loves Star Wars. And so let's go deeper into what kind of religious spirituality emerges out of Star Wars. And so this particular episode is the Star Wars approach to spirituality and religion. And I can't do this alone. So we
should call the Force sensitive episode. This episode is the Force sensitive episode.
It is so Force sensitive that you just don't know what to do with yourself. So we brought in long lost host James Demmel. James, you've been out doing youth ministry. You've had a busy summer, but you're back. You're here with Systematic Geekology. Welcome. What have you been up to? What have you been geeking out on? You're a fellow Star Wars fan with me. What's up? How you doing, James?
What's up, folks? I still exist. Been doing youth ministry this summer. Been on like 5 weeks of trips, and life moving real fast with the kiddos. So, but what have I been geeking out on? I've been reading a lot. Have read the entirety of the Wheel of Time series this spring.
You did?
Summer. I did in like 2 months. I like deep and like gone. Everything else was
double deep.
I know, yeah. And now I'm on to Brandon Sanderson, so I'm like, working my way through the Stormlight archive, and am absolutely riveted. But I'm also like mad because I have to read all the other books he wrote that's in the universe that aren't as good to get the full implications. It's a lot. Anyways, that's where I'm at.
Yeah, we're going to do an episode soon about like geek life balance. There's so much to geek out on. There's no like the what we can geek out on is like endless. And so where do we go? What do we do? And how do we balance that? But yeah, there's so much to geek out on. It's a good time to be a geek. And James, good stuff. Glad you're here and glad we can geek out on Star Wars with one another. You are a fellow Lutheran pastor with me. You were a member of my church, and then you went off to be a youth pastor at St. John's Lutheran in Salisbury, North Carolina. And we've circled back around to be co-hosts here at Systematic Geekology, and we're going to talk about Star Wars. So super excited about that. That other voice you hear is what I call the Podfather. The one who started it all, the one who was way back at the beginning doing podcasts. Tripp Fuller. We've done Theology Beer Camp, Systematic Geekology is going to be at Beer Camp. And
that's right.
And we first met geeking out on Star Wars with one another. Like we started talking Star Wars, we locked eyes at an event, and we became best friends. And we're like, what?
It was magical.
It was magical. And we've done some collaborative faith and science stuff together and grant money together. And we live in the same neighborhood somewhat together. And now we're doing, you did Theology Beer Camp at my church. You did another place.
I was about to say
a geek stage. We have a long
road trip together.
We road trip together. You had a Bojangles biscuit, and I didn't think we were going to make it to a bathroom in time, but we did. So like
that happened.
It happened.
We also went to cigar school together.
We did. Tripp, introduce yourself. What are you up to? What are you geeking out on? And then here we are talking Star Wars. Yeah. Share. What's up?
Okay. One, well, I am a member of the Systematic Ecology Patreon community. So I just wanted to say for all you listeners, you may be saying to yourself, I don't think I'm cool enough to be a member of the Systematic Ecology Patreon community. Well, I'm not that cool, and they let me donate each month to make this possible. Like occasionally, I like pull out my notebooks. I have notebooks where I take notes when I read books and stuff. And my current notebook, as I'm taking notes, preparing for this conference up at Princeton with Hartmut Rosa, rereading all his books. What's on it? I got my new Systematic Ecology sticker on it. What? Did I ask for the sticker? No, it just arrived because I'm a Patreon member. This is the kind of love that happens when you become one, and then occasionally get invited on. Now, last time I was on, I had my own cartoon character. You know, if that co-hosts get a cartoon character, but if you just come on long enough and frequently enough, then maybe you can get one. So I'm just saying, like, when people go like, oh, what's the most interesting thing that happened? When all of a sudden I have a Lord of the Rings themed cartoon character, I feel really good about myself. And so there's that. What am I geeking out on?
Yeah.
Our friend Nick Polk, we've been doing some fun with Lord of the Rings, which is my second favorite thing after the Bible.
Yeah.
When it goes to things I read. And so we're working on this project of doing podcasts that read Lord of the Rings chapter by chapter as if it was a sacred text. That's something we've been working on. None of that's come out, but we've been working on it. So there's that. So I've been rereading as sacrifice for all the podcast listeners, Lord of the Rings again this summer. Now I probably would have done it anyway, but you know what I mean? Also, I'm rewatching the first season of Rings of Power for the 5th time because Nick and I are going to do podcasts after all of the Rings of Power episodes this year, like we did 2 years ago. And I have to say, I enjoy it more each time. So I'm super pumped about this season of Rings of Power, and I'm excited about that. The other thing I'm working on is we just announced today when we're recording this, the first thing, the podcast runs Homebrewed Christianity. The thing we've been working on the longest, it's the most complicated, crazy, wild thing. And you two Lutherans, you should enjoy this. It is my giant Dietrich Bonhoeffer project.
Yeah.
So
that email hit my
Jeff Pugh and I.
Yeah.
That's what I like. Y'all open the email. I want you to know, everyone that has email lists, even if you love them, especially if it's an email that seems like it comes from a sponsor, you should always open and click something, even if you don't read it. But Jeff Pugh and I, who've done a number of Bonhoeffer classes, Bonhoeffer scholar, we interviewed 10 different Bonhoeffer scholars about the entire life of Bonhoeffer. We wrote a book that we wrote it basically to base this podcast, and we're making an 8-episode audio documentary podcast that tells the Bonhoeffer story and the rise of Nazis, and then what are the different theological questions he's asking at his life in these different points of time. And we're going to do a giant online class, got an audio documentary, got interviews with all these scholars, got selected reading. I'm just super pumped about it. And I've not been good at not telling people I was working on it, but now we are officially like talking about it. So riseofbonhoeffer.com, boom shakalaka. And Dietrich Bonhoeffer is a great Jedi.
A gray Jedi. There's a little teaser for what's coming up a little bit later in this particular episode. But yeah, that is right. That email hit my emails this like today, and I opened it and I read it, and I'm like, yeah, I'm all aboard. And I even shared it with like 3 of my friends. So there you go.
300's better, Will. 300's better.
Okay. Well, I'm at 300s later. All right. So
297 to go.
Theology Beer Camp is October what? 17th through 19th in Denver.
17th and 19th.
Yep. And Systematic Geekology will be a part of the Geek Stage. And so Geekshire, just like put in some promo codes and follow, and we can't wait to be a part of it. Lots of fun
Geekshire, stuff. All caps, no space, $50 off the ticket.
Yep.
Also, Systematic Geekology pregame playing D&D together.
Mm-hmm.
Did you not even know about this, Will?
No, I knew about this. I know about it. I'm okay because
I've already got messages from people about this. Also, apparently, I got caught in on the email chain. Jared Bias from Bible for Normal People.
Yeah.
Josh Gilbert, who's the editor for like Homebrewed, You Have Permission, a number of podcasts. Big Magic the Gathering card people. They got copied in on this whole thing about, we want to all bring our Magic cards and play while we're day drinking together in the back of rooms while we listen to theology podcasts. So I'm just saying, like, if that's your thing, I don't know what kind of mana you like to twist sideways as you're leveling up and shit, but you know, there are options.
there are options. What kind of mana? Man.
All mana matters at Theology Beer Camp, just like beer styles.
Mana.
All manners of mana?
Yeah. Yeah. Even if you're like the Lord of the Pit.
Gosh.
That's a deep cut. That's first generation Magic card. Lord of the Pit is a character. It's a card in Magic the Gathering. You were already too cool to get Magic cards but your youth group members did, Will. Do you remember this when it got cool? You were probably a youth minister.
Yeah. We have 3 generations of youth ministers. I was a youth minister in the 1900s and early 2000s. Then we had like Tripp, who was in the early 2000s into it. And then James.
Actually, 2000 to 2015.
Yeah. And then James is like presently doing youth ministry right now, National Youth Gathering, Lutheran down in New Orleans. He was there. He was doing all that shit. So like, here we go. All right. So this particular episode is a part of the religion series. Like, how do we plug in or think through religions in our fandoms? What emerges? What kind of religions emerge in our fandoms? It's no secret that I am a Star Wars fan. That's part of my first fandom when I was a kid, the original trilogy. And I will make the case that like Star Wars kind of started it all in terms of religion in our fandoms of the geek. Like the Force, it started with a Force choke and then a Jedi mind trick, and then it keeps going through these movies and the prequels of like Qui-Gon, and then you have Rey and Force healing. So there's all this whole like collaborative unveiling of what the Force means in this galaxy far, far away. And I brought 2 friends here with me that I know that are huge Star Wars fans, a fellow ELCA Lutheran pastor, James, and a process theologian, Tripp, who we bonded over Star Wars from the very, very, very beginning. So here we are talking about Star Wars.
I do teach at Luther Seminary now. So I'm like Lutheran adjacent.
You are Lutheran adjacent, and I'm super proud of that. I couldn't be more proud of that. So like first question, as we start to begin to think about Star Wars approach to spirituality and religion. Yeah, they don't necessarily have a deity, or there's not like this theism, but it's the Force. Like the Force dictates all what's going on within this fandom and within this universe. James, like, what was your first like engagement with Star Wars and with the Force? Like where did you emerge? You're a child of late 1900s, early 2000s. Like where did you first engage with
Star Wars? I was born in the 1900s, which I feel like this is a safe space to say that.
Okay, thank you.
My youth think that's crazy, but I'm going to claim it with pride here.
Okay.
Yeah, like I don't know, Star Wars is kind of like just part of the furniture of my like mind imagination. Like I can't remember a time when I hadn't seen Star Wars. So I'm pretty sure I was like 2 years old watching Star Wars on VHS with my dad before they made the edits.
The original trilogy? The original trilogy?
Yeah, over and over again. Yeah. And I remember, I think I was in second grade when episode 1 came out.
Ooh.
And I remember several days going to the theater, and then I remember like late elementary school years, like 3rd, 4th, 5th grade, watching like half of the Phantom Menace every day before school for like 2 years straight, waiting for the Attack of the Clones to get out. And you know what? Honestly, thank God I didn't know anything about bad writing when I saw Attack of the Clones the first time. You know, yeah, that's Star Wars for me. Big Qui-Gon fan. Qui-Gon's my favorite Jedi. So
that was the character and kind of approach to the Force that like embedded with you into like Qui-Gon, the Force, gray Jedi, like a little resistance against like institutional Jedi religion. But like the prequels, that was your first engagement. But do you remember like the first Star Wars movie you like actually saw was like the original series and then the prequels, or like how did that go?
Yeah, for sure. Definitely. Yeah, definitely. The original trilogy, watching it when very little with my parents.
Nice. Tripp. Our first bonding experience was like our love of Star Wars, but what was your first engagement with Star Wars that you can remember? And then what like attachment to a character or approach to the Force that you connected with as in your journey of imagination and fandom?
Well, yeah, I think we watch the original trilogy all the time. Every Christmas break, my brother and cousins, I just was like, we did that. We watched the Star Wars trilogy and James Bond movies. That was what Christmas break always involved. As we got older, like the Hanky and the Christmas Pooh South Park episodes got brought in. I mean, obviously, like It's a Wonderful Life. Now we all have kids, so it's like the Elf and those kind of things. But always Star Wars. And I'm like the right age that when Clerks came out and you're in art school and you go watch Clerks, like the moment you get a long scene that is basically just discussing random people that worked on the Death Star, you feel seen. Like there are certain people that were like, why would you dedicate like 2.5 minutes to a discussion of people that just worked in the Death Star? And then there are other people that go, Kevin Smith should have been like we would have been friends in high school, because I understand this predicament where you love this story. You're like, oh, we got a good old real clear guidelines here of baddies and goodies. And then you get older and then you just think there are probably a lot of people on that thing. Yeah. What's up with that?
Yeah, that's
and you feel a little bad, but obviously, like as Americans, we're really good at just pausing for a minute, thinking about it, and then being like, you got to do what you got to do. And so, now not wanting to minimize civilian deaths in war, I'm just saying that it raised it in a very funny way. That just as Americans, this is happening, and we do it all the time. So that was always there. I when they re-released the Star Wars films in theater was just an amazing time period. All my friends just get in line, had pizza delivered to it, us in line waiting, because you had to actually go to the theater to buy tickets, this kind of thing.
Right.
And then I kind of like fell back in love with it as a parent when my son got into Star Wars Legos and the Clone Wars show. I had never watched all the Clone Wars show, and then like ended up watching them all lots of times. And I'll say that when it goes to the question of the Force, there's like the kinds of framing of the Force for the original trilogy, but of all the stuff that happened after Last Jedi and the Clone Wars TV show are the best parts. The Mortis trilogy and Clone Wars, and then Last Jedi, Yoda showing up, having the whole convo with Rey, or not with Rey, with Luke, while Rey has already taken the text out of the old tree and smuggled them onto the smuggler ship. I'm just like, yeah, that's what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
And that was our original time, was right after that film came out, Will, that was the first podcast when apparently James's current professors at Campbell ditched us because there was ice in North Carolina, which basically means no one drives. All of a sudden, it's just like me and 10 people and beer for 80 in a room. And
then Will Rose rolls up and we're like talking Star Wars and Advent and game
on.
Sounds like a great problem.
Yeah. And I had grant money for faith and science stuff, and you're like, I like grant money. I'm like, come on, let's do some like faith and science stuff.
But I will say I've turned down lots of grant money to do stuff at churches where I would not want to hang out with the clergy. So just to be clear,
okay,
not that it's you personally, any clergy that I've said no to that listen to this podcast.
Right.
Sometimes I'm just busy and occupied. Sometimes it's like, oh.
Maybe those folks don't listen to this particular podcast.
Yeah. So like folks, you hear like our listeners, like it's no like in terms of how we think of our fandom, force, the religion, like Star Wars is embedded in the recent like controversy or like clickbait stuff with the acolyte and how you handle the force and dark side, light side is all there, still relevant. And that's why we talk about this stuff with systematic ecology is it's not clickbait stuff. We're not trying to like lure you in and then Jesus juke you. We love this aspect of how we understand spirituality along with imagination with sci-fi and Star Wars, but then how we think through our present context in terms of religion and the communities that we are entrusted with, and how we think through how the divine action in our midst in the communities that we shepherd, and so Star Wars is a big part of that. So that's kind of why we're talking about these things. And so the first time we engage with these movies and comics and TV shows really captures our imagination and spirituality, and with how we handle our own faith and our communities that we are a part of. So that's why we're talking about these things. And Star Wars is a intergenerational fandom. You have the original trilogy, you have the prequels, you have the sequel trilogy, but you also have the animated shows, you have the extended universe, and also the comic books. So there's so much that you can talk about, a breadth and depth of how you handle this particular fandom. And so it's pretty cool. Like it's no secret that the first movie I saw in the theater was 1977, A New Hope, and it captured imagination, the Star Wars action figures and playing with those, and Luke Skywalker and what that can mean in terms of a galaxy far, far away. James is another generation. Tripp is another generation. So we acknowledge that there's so many different ways to handle this particular fandom and how we handle spirituality and religion within our fandoms. Like as we talk about the original trilogy, Tripp and James, like the first time we hear about the Force is Obi-Wan talking with Luke. Isn't this kind of abstract idea? And then the first time we see the Force actualized is Darth Vader like choking out some like committee meeting around the Death Star. And then the other aspect is Obi-Wan doing a Jedi mind trick. So there's this kind of like black and white understanding of light and dark. How do you think through like how the Force is portrayed in the original trilogy? We'll eventually get to like some deconstruction, like gray Jedi, non-institutionalized aspect of it. But like the original trilogy, how do you see the Force used, and how does that portray like how religion was understood in the 70s and 80s and even the early 2000s?
Hey, Will.
Yeah.
When I heard this question, I'm actually like more interested in your answer, and here's why.
Mm-hmm.
You already loved the films before you took a religion class.
Yeah.
All right. So James and I have way more that we were familiar with, right? Like I was already a nerd, but like I grew up watching them, but like I also read Kierkegaard in middle school. You know what I mean? And it was already an established canon. You had the experience of watching the like the Force is being developed through the original trilogy. So you have this experience of, oh, episode 4, episode 5, episode 6. Oh, this is all we have. And like you mentioned, this is the genius of Star Wars. Action figures and then Lego Star Wars. Both of those things mean that multiple generations of kids, if their parents like it, they're like, oh, can I buy this video game? I don't know. Star Wars Lego? Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. Am I going to give you some toys? You're just looking at, do I want to watch any more He-Man? No. Do I want to watch Star Wars every Christmas? Yeah. You want a Death Star, honey? We might need to spend a little more at Christmas this year because little Will needs himself some action figures. So it's always been this universe where the fandom actually gets to play with it, and then expanded universe, comics, all these things, you see it. But what was your relationship to the Force slowly experiencing the original trilogy, and how did it change when your faith became something important enough that you're like, I vocationally want to steward it? And then you're thinking through all these big theological questions, learning to appreciate other parts of the church, other religious traditions. Like for you, how does the Force change before you see it explored in different ways, even in the Star Wars universe?
Yeah, that's such a good question. That's really kind of rooted of my particular identity. Like that was the first movie I saw in the theater, and I had the action figures, and it captured my imagination of like sci-fi. But then there was this like spiritual mysticism attached to this particular fandom that captured my imagination. That when I looked at the stars, it's like, yeah, it's a galaxy far, far away, a long time ago. And yet there is a deeper kind of grounded force that binds all things, like a spirituality, mysticism that not just the oh, that's fun. There's a classic Joseph Campbell journey of the hero, but of Luke Skywalker and a lightsaber and lasers, but also there's a force that binds all things together. And what does that mean for a deeper relationship of how I'm entangled with all things around me? So yeah, like I probably couldn't articulate that when I was like 5, 6, 7, 8 years old, when A New Hope and Return of the Jedi came out. But yet there was this underlining understanding that I'm connected to all things, and what does that mean? So I think that helped me understand my spirituality. I'm a lifelong Lutheran. My parents took me to church, and I was confirmed, I was baptized, I was part of youth group. I was a like goofy, act up, rambunctious surfer kid that didn't pay attention to the Sunday school teacher or youth director, but yet that was something that grounded me. And then Star Wars, I think, helped ground me and understand there's something bigger to the universe that we're a part of. And so that was definitely a part of that captured my imagination and how I understand how the universe works and who I'm connected with. So yeah, that's a great question. Like I think it was right alongside and journey alongside of, like, in terms of how my parents brought me to church and youth group and how I understand God and the universe. The Force was right alongside with that. But yeah, good question, James. In terms of you, in terms of like how you were brought up, like those movies, but yet spirituality, did you have a similar experience with those things?
Yeah, I mean, so it's interesting thinking about like just where we were culturally when like the original trilogy came out versus when the prequel trilogy came out, which was, where, I'd seen the original trilogy, and for me, I think about the Force and how it's portrayed there, and it's a little bit cleaner and less complex, right? There's a light side, there's a dark side.
Yeah.
And it's sort of this classic, like, light versus dark, good versus evil sort of narrative going on. It gets complex at the end with sort of, redeeming Darth Vader and this idea of balance. And then that gets picked up in the prequel trilogy and really just becomes much more complicated with themes of, are we holding on to this thing, these ideals so tightly, such that we're strangling ourselves and everyone around us, right? I mean, that's literally like the Force choke. The Jedi did it to themselves. And you sort of watch the tragedy of Darth Vader happen across the prequels. And but it's interesting to think about like where even society was, right? Like you're coming out of the wars of the early 20th century, and folks in the academy are thinking about deconstruction in the 70s, but it's not like disseminated amongst popular folks. I mean, it is when you think about the movements that are happening and social justice and anti-war and all that stuff. Hectic time to be, but you get to the 90s, right? You got Alanis Morissette playing and all this other stuff going on in the background, Kurt Cobain, and it's all ironic, right? And we're swimming in those waters right as the prequel trilogy is getting coming to life before us. And it's interesting how you start with this sort of classic good and evil story at the beginning, and it becomes increasingly sort of layered and complicated, even if the writing is bad and the midichlorians are bad.
Hi, my name is TJ. I'm here to tell you about the Systematic Ecology shop. That's where we post all of our merch. It is hosted on Creator Spring, and we have a ton of really cool merch, mostly clothing. We have hats, extra soft t-shirts, sweaters, hoodies, and more. Our hosts wear them all the time. It's actually super comfy. We have glassware, mugs, which everybody loves a good mug. Fill out your cupboard. Get rid of some old ones, which is the part that I never do. That's why I have too many cups. We have cloth bags, posters, and it's really stuff. We like to put our icons on there. We like to put quotes, things we come up with. And it's cool. It's a cool way, and a lot of it is pretty subtle too, to show support for one of your favorite shows. And my personal favorite is actually our SG dad cap, which I have been reluctant to buy it because now I have to wear hats at work, and then I get tired of wearing hats. But it's really cool. It's really understated. It is our logo right here, and then it says Systematic Ecology on the back. It's great. It's a really good hat. We have a few of them floating around. Check it out. And if we could all just rock the SG dad cap in public, I think that'd be pretty sweet.
Ooh, we talk about like biological determinism.
Midichlorians drop down.
Yeah.
I've actually been thinking of a way of redeeming midichlorians as a concept. We don't have to do that right now. No, because this is actually more interesting, what you just said, James. Because when you think of the original trilogy, it's very much a Cold War context.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So it makes sense that you have the goodies and the baddies are primarily where you stand on freedom and totalitarian state. And it getting framed this way because the conscience of America after World War II, it starts to define itself as the indispensable nation. So what's a world where the indispensable nation no longer has power? Then you need a rebellion, which is like that basic American narrative of like, who are we? We rebelled. We're this kind of thing. Think of just like big American energy. The prequel trilogy totally is one of those things that makes complete sense after, like, in that context of 9/11, what do you do after the Cold War? And in it when you like you drop the Alanis Morissette and irony thing. Like the funny thing is, like, the song doesn't actually have irony in it, and yet it is the mood, right? And so, or the vibe, in a sense, like there's an inherent irony and cynicism of that time, and it's something that culturally existed, but was hard to name. Like it was like we knew what we didn't like: big hair, or it's like 80s Wall Street greed. Like you could go through all these things, and yet the system itself can't imagine a world where you're not in charge, and it's trying to inscribe goodies and baddies on everything and justify what you're doing. And so then all of a sudden, the Jedi and that whole thing end up facilitating, with a assist from Jar Jar Binks, a giant problem, right? And then the archetype of baddie that's the redemption in the original one, Vader, you then like contextualize his story not because the writing was great, but the narrative is great in the sense that like being separated from your mother, like what do you do in your situation when you do have a big ass midichlorian count? Like you get removed just like all the other Jedi from their home, their culture, their place. You have to learn these rules, like, because this is what we do with power. We form it just as the one global superpower that loves freedom and liberty wants you to. And obviously it's a republic, but then it gets perverted. And it gets perverted because you can't imagine power being oriented and shaped by genuine love and care, right? Be it for his mother, be it for Padme. You see both in Luke and in Anakin's story places where their care for other people become problems for their own kind of the rule of the Jedi. And so that whole story plays out that sets up, like you end up having this giant tragedy of Anakin that the Clone Wars show makes even more palpable. But when you get to the newest trilogy, it is this actually is like a way of enjoying it, even if I would have written it differently. Like it is the inability to piece together a narrative that makes sense of power in a world that is so complex. The injustice, your awareness of injustice, you're inherently complicit and can do no other. And you just want a narrative where you know that if you're giving yourself to it, you're on the right side. And that's something that is the basic need of Rey. Like, I need a story, right? I want to be on the right side, and I want to know about my parents, this whole thing. By the time you get to the last one, it gets even more complicated because there's a Palpatine relation. The whole story of Ben not is sitting there, and it's like just as complicated. You sit there and Leia's own relationship and Han's relationship. They have their whole dynamic with their child, Leia and Luke's relationship, even Luke's own relationship with Yoda that plays out in episode 7 and stuff. All these things have this, like, human beings are inscribed in this giant story, right? And you know who you want to win the battle. And yet no one's story, like, everyone can tell their story where they are a good guy, but none of them can give like a way where they're not complicit in things that are morally complicated. And I think a lot of the OG fans, those of us that are just like, give me 4, 5, and 6, and I can do the others for context, that what we were resisting is wanting a story that did give us a narrative that we felt at home in, the reality that more and more people are experiencing. If this Star Wars is very much a story about American conscience. It refuses to give us one because no one knows how to tell a story that way. It would feel wrong to make 4, 5, and 6 today, right? Like, you would make it today and go, yeah, but insert Israel and Palestine. Yeah, sure, but insert all these kinds of things. And so one of the things I really love about the gaps between the trilogies is in an odd way, especially even the last one, because you have who know that's not a well-planned trilogy if you were just laying it out, right? Like, if one person was laying it out. I think the new trilogy is like if J.R. Tolkien wrote the first one and then you were just like, he pieced out, and then you were like, well, what if some fanfic wrote the next one, and then you were just like, oh, we got to bring this back, so like let's find our favorite Tolkien scholar to kind of like connect the dots. It reads that way, right? But that's actually how it works. Like, when you look at the public discourse in both of the political parties' conventions, they're trying to give narratives that are as clear as 4, 5, and 6. And the reason we all roll our eyes is because they are unwilling to talk about the underside of things. And yet, what do? We get moved because, like, the vice president's kid is like, that's my dad, and he's Lutheran. And you're like, yeah, like, because it's beautiful, because kids should love their parents that much. Like, you're a really cool parent if your kid's gonna like tear up, or if Kamala steps, like, she's like their stepmom, and they're like so proud of her and moved, and like, you're like, this is great, like, this is awesome. And yet we all know like what you're trying to be in charge of. But in 4, 5, and 6, the rebellion's a dream. Like, it's like, what can we give it? And then you find out what came of it. And then And then in 1, 2, and 3, you go, this is how they got here? Well, no wonder. And then now you got these really cool shows. And Andor is the best example that is just like, well, here's the thing. All these shows are still working with human beings. And let me tell you what you're working with human beings, right? Humans. And I actually think that's the brilliance of Andor, not just that it's like, oh, well, what are the civilians doing? What's the complicated things behind the scenes? No, it's going like, no, human beings are involved. And guess what humans are? We're messed up and beautiful things happen. And if you can't deal with that, then, tell nice, neat stories, insist that it's like literal, final, and complete, and put your head in the sand. And so, like, there's a kind of beauty to me of like all 3 trilogies when you realize where they come from in their time, that, like 4, 5, and 6 are like Lent, where you're just like, look, we're going to do all Jesus and disciple sermons the whole time. And it's going to end where the Death Star really gets taken out.
Yeah.
And then the next thing you know, a few months later, it's Christ the King Sunday and the junk starts all over again. You want to know why? Because God's working with humans and we got a problem and we can't even enjoy what we get. And then we screw up what we got.
James, I need a response. What do you think there? Right.
I'm just thinking like how I'm just thinking about how would you talk about sin in the Star Wars sort of narrative? You have this sort of impersonal force supposedly that you're working with, and Christian theology. You can think about sin in many ways, but in Star Wars, it's all choice based, right? You choose the good, you choose the bad. It has corrupting influences, and Christian in thought, there's a spectrum where you have some folks thinking that sin is a power influence, right? That comes and corrupts you. And I'm wondering, like, how that could fit in this sort of cycle that we're seeing across these trilogies of, you have the dream, you realize the dream is more complicated because we're humans and morally complex beings, but also, right, in the Star Wars, sort of all the shows I'm thinking of, it goes back to this sort of myth of you choose, and your choice is what gets you in the boat. For
Do you
good
think
or bad.
that? So I think, like, yes, there's like the waxing and waning of force polarity in people, and there's that dynamic. But a lot of the turning points are not like somebody choosing to will evil. Like Jar Jar, the reason Jar Jar pisses people off, apart from Misa wants to annoy you, is like there's absolutely nothing about Jar Jar's character that makes you think his excommunication from the Gungans is a moral failure. He's clumsy. He's not the brightest Gungan around, and that kind of thing. But everything about him demonstrates like he genuinely cares for other people. The moment he gets positive attention, he uses the whole like, oh, I have to protect them because he saved my life bit. But you can see like genuinely cares for anyone that looks at him positively. And he steps up in a place of need for leadership for his planet and is doing what he thinks best. Right. So like, but that's like the linchpin. That's how Palpatine gets in charge. Isn't someone being vile? They're being stupid.
Sure.
And that's actually like not, if you're not looking at the main players of history, right? Like, just because I finished this giant project on the rise of Nazis in Germany and paralleling the questions Bonhoeffer's asking, like part of the problem, this is something he realized towards the end of his life, is like evil's clear in the sense of like someone's going to hurt someone, like that can be clear. Stupidity is a bigger problem because if the narratives you've inherited are ones that prime certain fears, certain resentments and things, then doing the good for the people that you love can be harnessed for ill means, right? And that's the dark side. The more complex a story gets, yes, there are like agents that are going, like intentionally doing it. But there's a whole number of people who, if you ask them to tell their own story, if they were sitting there with their like therapists, they're a hero in their story. And yet the consequences are ugly. And I think like knowing that there's both levels, like the deliberate, intentional, willed action that's vile, problematic, leads to decrease in well-being and violence. And then there's like that our stories are so small or uninformed, or there's ignorance, or all these other kinds of things, where even people willing the good become collaborators of sorts. And that's actually one of the benefits of the prequel, is the kind of complexity that humans have are there. Because in the original, the moral complexity is Han Solo. Like he's not even sure what he even thinks about the Force and stuff, but it was friends that turned his heart, right? And I always like to say that, like, probably like Chewie cornered him after he like pieced out and just wanted money, and she was like, "Wah!" Which I guess in Wookiee was just like, don't be a dick, Han.
The moral integrity of a Wookiee turned to him and said, "Hey, dude, yeah, we've seen a lot of things, but yeah, you trust your blaster, but maybe friendship's like a greater good." Yeah, like I love all that, but I think what we're leaning into is like this understanding that the Force and this particular universe leans into the interconnected ability of all people. Like there's relationships and who we're connected to that leans us into the light and the dark. And there's no theism within Star Wars. There's the Force, and then like, how are you going to use that, the light side or the dark side? And then the original trilogy leans into this kind of binary of light and dark. The prequels lean into this kind of like institutionalized high council that has rules and morals and who's going to be like a Jedi or not. And then the sequels go a little bit more gray, which was already kind of there in the prequels. But this understanding of whenever you have the Force or you have something that people believe in or experience, it's natural for people to organize around it and form like a organization or a committee or something to say like, we're going to form a creed or rules around this thing that we've experienced. And I think that's there for the Force in Star Wars. You have the Force sensitive people. There's this natural understanding of how the universe works, this mysticism, but then there's this institutionalized religion that forms around it, which is natural. And you have the Jedi, and then you have the Sith, the light side and the dark side. But then when you get into the prequels and even some of the like animated shows and the TV shows or the streaming series, you get more of this gray of like rejection or deconstruction of the institution of this Jedi High Council. Where do you guys see how like religion forms around the Force, and then there's Force sensitive people that aren't necessarily attached to this Jedi High Council? James, you and I are both ordained ministers within the North Carolina Synod that have creeds and things that we like attached to or pledge allegiance to, and yet there are people out there who have no understanding what that means. The Force kind of works that way too in this particular universe. There's the High Council and Jedi, but then there are people who are like, I just know that the Force exists within me. Like, how does that play out? Like organized Force religion versus the nuns in Star Wars.
Thinking about that moment in the Reformation where Luther's like, everyone, you can read the Bible and you can interpret for yourselves. And then people started standing up during his sermons and being like, no, you're wrong. That's not what I think it means. That's not what I think it means. And how do you like watching Luther backpedal? Go learn Greek. It's interesting. You think about the prequels, and there's a sense of awe over like what the Jedi are and what this system is and what this thing is. And then you go by the end, like, man, where to go wrong? How do you keep something like that healthy? how do you keep a system? How do you keep an organization? How do you keep an organized religion, right, healthy? Because the whole thing is just a tragedy of self-destruction. And of course, Palpatine gets in there and games the system, but he's able to do it, right? Because there are definitely flaws and errors and many things to be gamed. And I think even the Acolyte makes that abundantly clear.
Yeah.
This show is recently out, just because you think you're doing the good, just because you think you're the hero in your own story, right? Doesn't mean you haven't lied to yourself. So how do you keep yourself honest?
Yeah, good thought. Tripp, you've written a book on deconstruction, like in terms of, where Star Wars went from the original trilogy to the prequel to even the sequel. You have Rey, who's learning about the Force. The Force is stirred up when there's an awakening with her, a new awakening, and then she encounters this organized religion, deconstruction, cynical Luke Skywalker, and then the sacred texts. And she smuggles these sacred texts back onto the Millennium Falcon, the symbol of rebellion and those kind of things, and go off. In terms of deconstruction, and then what happens next, like what is in terms of this universe, how's that parallel in terms of where we are in religion and spirituality and how we deconstruct, but yet we don't want to let go, and how we reconstruct.
Yeah, so I think there are two features here. One is the institutional side of it, that's problematized, of the way Jedi religion harnesses the Force, and the other is the plausibility structure for any depth dimension, right? So one of the things about the starting with 4, 5, and 6 is it's really clear that the Empire, in wanting to get rid of the threat of the Jedi and Force sensitive people and only harnessing it, what is this? I mean, you remember in the original trilogy, Tarkin is making fun of Jedi religion. Oh, you're just like, this is your old shit. Good old Vader's running around with this. Like, this is over. He's similar to Han in the sense that they both are like, no, we got blasters, we got Death Stars, this is how power works, right? And both Vader and Obi-Wan in Episode 4, like, there's more to reality than your kind of reductive materialist account of it. It's not just like material power. Right. This is not what the only story in town is. And so 4, 5, and 6 are this kind of re-enchantment, in a sense, of the universe, where there is a depth dimension that had been so channeled and institutionalized by Jedi, right? Like Force sensitive people. We see this in one of the Star Wars Origins, right? Like Ahsoka, who's eventually Anakin, future Vader's Padawan, is taken from her planet, her people, her culture. And so like anyone that is Force sensitive in this intense, deep way becomes what? They become the connection to the depth dimension is harnessed and said, here's how it gets to be expressed in our world. It gets to be expressed in this one institution called the Jedi, right? And so, and the Jedi, when that institution fails, it falsifies and problematizes a connection to that depth dimension. So 4, 5, and 6 is this moment of re-enchantment, in a sense. And because the failure of the Republic, Luke and attempting to, re-kick things off, re-encountering because of his rather, dualist version of the Force that he received and his stuff, he can't recognize the reality and the problematic nature of just human beings, and it leads to the whole setup in the third trilogy. And so like Rey's bit there, like one of the things I think it's connecting to our current moment is a recognition that something is getting itself done in these historic wisdom traditions and in these institutions that if we were just talking about the institutions, or just talking about the historicity of this, or just talking about like the objective things you want to measure and the way modern people assess rationality or factuality or whatever of something, like if you're doing it on those terms, you can just get rid of it or whatever. But then there's something else that was getting itself done, and perhaps its life is bigger than the place you put it, right? So those sacred texts are in this original place, and like,
right.
and Luke's like, what do I do with this? I'm going to cut myself off from this rather than relate to it, because I see the problems of it when it's channeled in this institutional space. And so Rey and her narrative is a sense of like a rediscovery of the reenchantment, and it becomes possible. After that initial encounter, the scene which any basic human being, like if you don't like the Messiah chorus, and if you don't want the Hallelujah chorus on Easter, then like just don't be a Christian. Right? And if you don't get moved when Han and Chewie come back on the Falcon and they're like, oh, we're home.
Yeah.
And they're like, yeah. And then when he gets like layered with questions about the Force and all this stuff, he goes, he gets that face. And is it true? And his face is just like, you have no idea. Like, and to me, like that dynamic runs through it. Like there's like in the trilogies, there's different plausibility structures for whether culture can acknowledge the depth dimension, and you see it move. But then there's the problematizing of institutions. So the newest trilogy continues to problematize institutions, but it wants to say more was present in the Force than was expressed in Jedi religion. Sure. And the finality of the way it channeled and mediated and determined how the Force can be expressed is a problem. But we're not going to throw the baby out with the bathwater. We're not going to say that we're just like matter in motion. And when I think of people that are deconstructing, when I think of a lot of it, some of them come out because they have like nerd questions, right? Like, oh, the problem of evil, multiple religions. And that's like basically related questions that come up if you think one expression of religion or Force or spirituality or whatever, there's only one. And those have solutions and problems and you can wrestle with it. But then there are these existential problems, right, where the impact of religious traditions, say like shaming around LGBTQ stuff and sexuality, or attaching religion to Christian nationalism or empire religion, like those kind of things problematize it in a different way. And the genius, I think, of Rey's character is she is very much is the character of people in the crisis of meaning that's taking place in culture. People that are like, I would like to tell a story about myself where I came from somewhere and my own agency in the world contributes to something bigger than me and is grounded in something beyond me. And that is her quest. It's related to her family initially. And obviously the family thing runs through the whole thing because of the Palpatine junk in episode 9, which is whatever, bad writing. But
oops.
But when it goes to the Force, right? The most redemptive moment in episode 9 is her and Princess Leia's relationship.
Oh.
And the decision at the end both to bury the lightsabers, not destroy them, and then name herself as a Skywalker, right, is to say that the Force has a future beyond Jedi religion.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I just say, as Lutherans, I really think that's like a very Lutheran move, right? Part of what Luther was doing is that, like, what God did in Christ, the gift of divine belovedness is not something that could be captured in a church. The church can serve it, right? But like, even what's Luther's response about a sacramental universe, which is one of my favorite things about Luther is above, below, around, like
within, under, yeah.
It's just like, no, that's what where we live, move, and have our being. Like everything comes from God and has the potential for being seized by God, and you can be caught up in something, and yet it's not the gift of grace or the gift of divine presence doesn't come with a place. It doesn't come in a way that it eradicates your own cooperation and participation. It's a synergetic participation, and Rey's learning to trust the reality of that depth dimension without it being funneled, determined, shaped by a singular narrative of Jedi religion. And I think that is a beautiful way, at least a way of reading that trilogy that then goes like, what are the gifts for the people that are deeply committed to historic wisdom traditions? How do we give the gift if we don't tell it as if our hands are seized around the gift we're given, but we're contributing wisdom in an open-handed way for people who are always already in connection with the Force or with the divine, with the Spirit? That I think that's a beautiful picture of it. Yeah. And it's one that the deconstruction is oriented towards those that think they can channel or canal the reality of the divine for their own means. Not those that come alongside. Like even there, you think about like Jesus' own prayer in John chapter 17. I'm going, but the Spirit's going to come alongside you, the Paraclete, the one who journeys with you, that comes alongside. And that's like the wisdom that Luke gets from Yoda in that big deconstruction movement. When the texts have left, he's burning down the institution. And what Yoda's going, the whole grow beyond line, which is just like money. What he ends up functioning as in episode 7 is the one who enables a future that he can't in and of himself imagine. He's trusting the Force to be channeled in a way that the institution that gave it to him and he gave himself to and sees as a failure, he's trusting the Force beyond it. And when I think of the church, I think part of what we have yet to understand well is that we can trust the Spirit of God and give the gifts and wisdom of our tradition without thinking. The only place it can reside and the only way it can be expressed is in our own means. And in that way, like that element of the newest trilogy is so George Lucas. Yeah. Like that is the place I think they got George Lucas's heart wide, because he genuinely loved and appreciated and valued multiple religious traditions and thought that we can't bifurcate it and lock it up in one place. So there are beautiful ways it resonates with multiple traditions, and it captured the imagination for multiple generations of people. The Force has, and what the wager of the reality of the Force is: are we in a cold, heartless universe, and the only meaning, purpose, and value that exists is what we created of ourselves, or is a more accurate depiction one where there's a depth dimension to existence? And on our best days, our liturgies, rituals, poetry, stories, ideas, and reflections, and rhythms and practices orient us to come in more harmony of what the Spirit, the Force, the divine is inviting us into. And so, yeah, to me, anyway, sorry for rambling. But yeah, no, I loved it.
That's beautiful.
That's my way of thinking of the third trilogy as kind of like the deconstruction trilogy.
And yeah, like you and Tom Moore wrote a book on like faith after deconstruction and what that looks like. And I think in terms of where Star Wars is today, it is playing around with those themes and ideas in terms of how the Force works and how we deconstruct a Jedi religion versus, because you have like the Force, and then you have these institutions around it, whether it's Jedi or Sith, the rule of two, the Jedi High Council, and then they try to like control it with their rules and what this means. And yet there's people out in the universe who still have this understanding of being Force sensitive and what that means to connect with one another and the universe and the people around them. And so it's not just like reduced to a Jedi religion or how the Sith understand it, the light and dark side. There's other understandings. And I think Rey, I have my problems with how the sequel trilogy treated the legacy characters, but yet Rey and how she understands the Force and relates to it and this deconstruction, but also keeping the sacred text and wanting to learn more and learn about Luke and moving forward, I think is a beautiful way that they can move on with the universe ahead. And it's not necessarily that this particular universe of Star Wars is only about the Skywalkers. It's about the Force as well and our approach to the Force and how that relates to one another. So, yeah, beautifully said. James, did that spark anything in you in terms of thinking through of?
It did.
We have the Clone Wars, we have Baby Yoda, we have many ways in which we approach this
we're not even
non-understanding of the Force in the Star Wars universe. But What sparked that in you in terms of some thoughts and reflections?
Yeah, I'm thinking about Luke and like his call to force ministry. You know, how you feel like, at least, from a clergy perspective, whatever that looks like for you, you feel like, you've got a call, you've got this connection, you want to live it out in some way, you have a vocation, you want to make your profession, whatever. And then the narrative that you're handed to you, right, is creaking and groaning, and yet you're so captured by it, right, that you can't think around it. And so, like, what does Luke do? Right? He tries to do the exact same thing. He tries to make a Jedi temple. He tries to do the Jedi thing all over again, and yet it creaks and groans and breaks, right? And then he shuts himself off from it, right? And how many people have we know? I know people like that. I'm sure you both, know people who the narrative has become so cracked that they can't think around it, and so they just shut themselves off from it, right? And so it's I love that. I'm thinking about the sequel trilogy in a very different way right now, but it's interesting to think that Luke has this faith moment again at the end and lets it go, so that there can be a more open future, right? I'm thinking a little bit about I'm actually thinking a little bit about Light Side, Dark Side, and Hartmut Rosa Resonance. And I'm thinking, if you've read that book, or if you know anything about his thought, the three axes of resonance. We have this vertical connection of resonance. Beyond us, we have a horizontal dimension of resonance, our relationships that we experience in our life. And then we have a diagonal axes of resonance, the material world around us, right? And so both light side and dark side, they're connected to this sense of there's something beyond me, there's something out there that's powerful and divine in a sense. And what does the light side do? They cut off the materiality from it. And so their horizontal relationships grow sick. And conversely, the dark side, right? You cut off the horizontal relationships. And so everything that you want material wise, power, influence, whatever, that all becomes sick too. And so how does the third party, right? The connection to above, this sense that there's a universe and there's a force that connects us and our relationships with people and our relationships to the actual material world of things. How do all those function in balance in such a way that, we stay healthy?
Yeah. And I think Star Wars, like it's not a theistic universe. Like there's not like this God power, even in Tolkien, Lord of the Rings, there's like a hierarchy of pantheon of a God and then reduced down to, but there's like this force that connects all things. Like Tripp, you're a process theologian, like this force of this entanglement with other people and what you lean to, the light and the dark. And then you have like, the Sith and the Jedi, but then you eventually lean into like Baby Grogu, and you have Rey, and you have Ahsoka, and you have the Acolyte. That there these other people out there that they're force sensitive, that aren't necessarily attached to an institution or rule or a creed. That this universe fascinates me with that. Like in terms of how you think there, as a process theologian, philosopher, this idea of entanglement, relationality. There's not like a theism rooted within this world, but yet, as Obi-Wan says, before we even know what the Force is, Obi-Wan's talking to Luke, and he's talking about like this thing that binds all things together. Before we even see it actualized with Darth Vader choking out somebody out at like a committee meeting, like he abstractly talks about the Force of this interconnected aspect of life and relationality. What, as a process theologian and philosopher, how does that resonate with you?
Well, I think that, okay, there's two responses. One is process philosophy in general tends to appreciate the kind of imagination that comes up when using the Force. So like there's lots of connections there, and I think that, all right, well, I'm going to avoid a large process aside, but just that, part of what the Force, if you just exist in that world, right? Like, here's one of the predicaments that humans have a hard time, right? So if we go asking like, oh, let's create a whole nother world in our head, and let's say you create your George Lucas and you come up with this, then um, human beings, like anything we use with language, including words like God, at our best days, they can be, the language is symbolic and it has traction with whatever we can't put into words. But language is always an orienting activity, right? So that's why, like, Augustine goes, well, if you sit around and describe God and give me the most beautiful description, even if it's accurate, you have not talked about God, right? So part of actual theism, and this does not mean that a large number of theists are really just practice folk religion, and that's not even that necessarily a critique. It's just that those that think about what the language of God is talking about recognize that language is a human construction, and no construct that's trying to describe an object will be actually accurate about a transcendent subject. It's one, you're using language that describes an object. So I could describe you, Will, and I will be describing my concept of Will that's based on the fact that we're friends. And I will be more accurate today than I would at any point in our relationship because we've known each other longer. But it will still fall short. Right. And because you're like a genuine subject and you are mysterious, and I learn more about you over time. Even Cindy will get it wrong in places, and how y'all relate to each other is because you both know that the other person is more of a mystery than the idea you have in your head. How we mess up. I messed up today relating to Alicia. We've been married now longer than we've been alive without each other, and I still don't understand her. And if I think she's just the idea in my head, I'm going to screw up. Now, if just the people you give yourselves to completely and try to love completely, or your closest, deepest friends, they are not the object you have in your head, even though it's better or worse and it helps you relate and love them better, then now go the source and mystery of all existence, right? This is what Augustine's pointing out. It's what the apophatic tradition and religious traditions are pointing at, that everything you say has to be unsaid, not because you're wrong, but because you're limited. It's human words. We invented language, and it helped us connect and understand and relate to the divine, but it has its limits, right? The Force is like the moment you reframe the deep mystery into language that doesn't allow the kind of crystallization an anthropomorphic language does, like theism, you've kind of like forced into your kind of like spiritual imagination what all the monotheistic traditions knows true the moment you talk about God as a person or God as like an object, right? So like George Lucas using that language kind of short circuits our habits as Western people to think our objects are reality, or our maps of reality are the thing. And this is true also about science, right? Math does this just as much as language. So and so it kind of instills the necessary humility to talk about ultimacy. So if you just take that, force language after that, the kind of reflection you have, it makes you think relationally and interconnectedly, and think that your own agency in every moment is there's a spectrum of possibility, and you get to respond in more or less beautiful, just, loving, kind ways. And that is literally what all three monotheistic traditions think happens if you understand God correctly. This is when you say you should love your neighbor as yourself, and if you want to love God with all your heart, mind, and strength, then you're going to love your neighbor as yourself. Underneath that is an intuition that to understand ultimacy, to orient yourself towards the divine, is to orient yourself in loving and caring ways to the people around you. And then what is it? As you love yourself, that you can't do that without understanding yourself also as an object of divine belovedness, right? And if you just go, what are the limits of theism? Okay, that's there. So then what would be the blind spots? Insert force language. What is force language telling us about our blind spots? Namely, that we don't understand the ways we're always already connected and into a web of relations.
Oof.
What is force language helping us think about our activity? It's saying that in this web of interrelations, you can't opt out of, but you can dwarf and kind of like minimize your imagination as if you aren't connected. And that, what does that lead to? The desire to control the other, the desire to get your own will, because the optimal relations between you and other people and you and all these and the rest of the universe is that they are objects to get to where you're going, right? Like to claim your own needs and desires. Anakin's big fear of death, right? He wants to conquer death. Why? So he can have what he wants. What is the Palpatine wants a solution. What's the solution? To have power, right? Like the temptations to even all the good people throughout it is what? They want to be in control. The desire for control is a short circuit for all spiritual awakening. And I hadn't even connected those dots till James brought up the Hartmut-Rosa connection. But like one of the things, Hartmut-Rosa, German sociologist, if you're interested in it, there's lots of things on Homebrewed about this. But why I had never made the connection till James brought it up. Now I showed up here to learn this tonight, so I can ask Rosa about this, because I'm doing a live podcast with him at Princeton in September. And he even puts this in his brand new book, came out last week, Why Democracy Needs Religion. And he, at the end of it, he's like, yeah, religion misses the point. They try to control everything because it was like these habits of responsiveness have been helpful. And now that, and instead of going, these habits of responsiveness are helpful, they go, these are the only habits that generate connection to the divine. Right. And so like the people that tell you, no, you're not in a blind, inert universe and have to create all your own meaning. In fact, there's way more going on. And here's our orthodox understanding of it. It's just like y'all are missing the point. You are the only people that get, like, religions are the ones that are making the wager that the universe you find yourself in is one that is intimately connected, all to each other, and the most human moments for us are the ones where we are not the authors of what happens, right? And he gives an example like listening to music or dancing, making love, sitting in a symphony, the kinds of things that happen. Like, we've all preached sermons. When people will come up to you after it and they'll be like, they'll tell you a story, and you realize they've encountered the divine and completely missed your sermon.
Yeah, you got that.
Right? But you're like, that's what you heard? And you're like writing it down. I'm like, I'm totally mentioning this in the second service. And then I know I've had students in seminary, they're like, well, and I told them this is what I really meant. And I'm just like, you don't understand. Way more is going on than you think, right? So like, and where's that come from in Protestantism? Namely, that we think it's our vocation to tell everyone what the word is, right? Like you come in, you invoke the presence of the divine, you confess your brokenness, then you affirm their deep belovedness before God. You respond to the wisdom of the elders in the sermon after you read the text, and then somehow Protestants are the worst at this. We actually think that our whole point was to communicate to them our particular interpretation of something. They've encountered the divine, heard something completely different, had this experience, and then we're like, well, hold on, that's actually Marcionism. Or insert like whatever the heresy we're saying. That's not what I was saying. And I know that feeling, and I've had tons of students say it. And I actually think that's like the Jedi's problem is like they can't differentiate the map they've created that has all this wisdom in it, but it also has like all the layers of sediment that could come from the context where the Force was really powerful in a moment, on all these kinds of things. Humanity, the spirit, all these things are so much more mysterious, and that's cool. Like, it's cool. And one of the gifts, I think, of all the new material is there are different creators with different experiences of the divine, the spirit, or whatever language you want to use for just like the depth dimension of existence. And then they go into a universe that the traditions in the universe are not inherently theistic, but they still are telling stories where you either are or are not responding to the call of responsibility, the face of the other that demands something from you, right? But the face of the other demands something from you is like the heartbeat of faith throughout all the scriptures. The demand of the other gets used. Theistic language is what we use for it.
Yeah.
But to me, it's like why impose the very same framework that we as clergy know generates all sorts of problems within our own tradition on this other place. So like it not being theistic, actually, I think it brings the guard down.
Yeah.
So tons of people, even if I want to use theistic language and think it's more accurate and could go on long talks as just a philosopher about why, well, actually, I think this, or this. But when it just goes to what culture's doing, our culture, for very good reasons, does not trust its ancestors. It thinks God is the only symbol we can use to talk about the depths of reality. Personally, I think the depth of existence was revealed in a story I could not tell without the word God in it, and in particular, the story of Jesus. But are you telling me that God is as limited as we are? That just seems weird.
Yeah.
Like, and even in the Star Wars universe, it uses the phrase force, right? But like one of the coolest things happens in comic books, happens in the show, is you discover all these different communities and people that the Jedi encounter and are like, no, this is called the Force, and let us take your people and go put them in our religious tradition so we can harness this reality on our own. Or well, before we started recording, you mentioned the Yoda comic where he goes to a whole nother planet that had never been recognized.
Yeah.
Right. And and so they didn't know it. And they have a deep relationship with the Force. It's tied to their planet, but they don't use Force language at all. And Yoda, in order to actually be helpful, has to learn how their own culture has cultivated a relationship with this depth dimension, with the interpenetrating web of relations. And until he understands that, he can't be present, acknowledge, and contribute to it. And so it forces people that are theistic to think about the divine when you join the Star Wars universe and the Force. And then in the tradition itself of the Star Wars tradition, it forces the Jedi to think about it being bigger. And that's cool because, the moment you show up in your small group and are just like, actually, could we consider the limits of using the word God? They're going to be like, Reverend Will,
what are you talking about?
What do you mean? How do we talk about this without talking about God?
I definitely want to talk about this particular comic because we bonded over this before. Jason Aaron, we've interviewed him before on other platforms in your own podcast. But like, in terms of like people who clicked on this episode because it said Star Wars on it, like, did you know that you were going to go this depth of like how we understand the nature of reality and the Force and theism? Like, there's different approaches to the Force within the Star Wars universe and the expanding universe, in the same way within our own kind of faith and Christendom, of these different approaches to how we understand God, how we understand the aspect of faith and what that means to our communities and who we relate with is all there. So that's kind of why we do systematic ecology and why there's Theology Beer Camp and why these things and avenues to go and explore these avenues of terms of this nature of reality and something deeper of how we understand the nature of reality. And I love that aspect. But yeah, as Tripp alluded to, James, I don't know if you've read the Marvel Star Wars universe rebooted with Jason Aaron, who also of Thor fame and Jane Foster fame. But their Star Wars, Marvel Star Wars issue number 28, back in like 2015, 2017, something like that. There's this like standalone story, this little story arc of Luke Skywalker discovering Obi-Wan Kenobi's journal, and he's just reading it, and then he discovers this story of Yoda, and he has no idea who Yoda is and what he looks like, but he reads this story of Yoda being called and lured by the Force to this planet, and he answers the call and goes to this planet and discovers these children on this planet, these warriors, almost like a Lord of the Flies. But he discovers this planet is like really infused with the Force, and the rocks within itself, the geo nature of the Force of the planet itself is infused with the Force. Is very highly Force sensitive. He has to think through the Force in a different way. Tripp, when you read that, we bonded over this before, this particular story arc of Jason Aaron and Yoda and encountering this Force infused planet. What stood out for you, and how we understand kind of faith, religion, institutional? It really kind of, Yoda's a part of the high institution of the Jedi Council, but yet he experienced the Force in a new way, and yet he's open to it. What stood out that for you? And we encourage our listeners to go out and find this on Marvel Unlimited, wherever, but it's a pretty cool way to think through the Force from Jason Aaron, who tends to be someone who's agnostic, atheism, but also like loves religious questions and what that can mean.
He's also just a brilliant theologian.
Correct.
This is like also his comic series Goddamned is also kind of brilliant. Okay, so if people are like, oh, this sounds weird, one, you should just go read it. But two, this isn't even, we've canonized this stuff. If you read Esther and Song of Songs, God does not show up in them things. But they're canonized. You know why they're canonized? Because they're trustworthy testimonies from our ancestors of faith about the divine reality, and they were told without reference to God. Right. So Yoda in this comic shows up and no one knows what's a Force to do about nothing. Right. But he does know, he does have this sense that he could trust what he understands as the Force and lean into that understanding it enough to get to know another world, another reality, a whole planet that encounters the same reality he does with a completely different framework. Right. So the story of Esther does it. Story of Esther is like a whole narrative. Right. Song of Songs has some erotic poetry up in that piece. And yet they are sacred texts. Right. And so he shows up and realizes, much like if you think of like the missions of the church, one of the reasons I think people are fascinated by Celtic Christianity is it is a Christianity that comes to a place and actually contextualizes and embeds itself in a culture by cooperative engagement rather than imperial like colonialism. Right. And people love what has come out of it. You know what comes out of what happens when you don't say like convert or die? That means that there's wisdom. The wisdom of the divine that was always already present, that culture and those people have come to know, gets to become a gift where there's mutual transformation in the peoples that are gathered. And so Yoda, who is like the pinnacle of Jedi religion, like the one everyone knows is wise and junk, and he functions as that right in the trilogy. And is the one that sees his own error in all these kinds of ways, right? He's the one who shows up and realizes that he's the one that has to commute culturally to be a blessing. He doesn't have to like come and impose. And he had been the one that like is head of the Jedi Council. That's what he did, right? Like y'all have to come here. And so that story to me is a rather beautiful one, and coming out of someone like Jason Aaron, whose dad, the moment he asked good questions in high school, is like, well, you can't believe that and be a Christian. His response was what he told Will, and I was like, well, I guess I'm not a Christian. Right. And you kind of want to be like, well, I wish you'd asked Yoda, because you know what he would have said? He'd have been like, well, there was this one time I went to this other planet. And you won't believe this. Oh, he thought we knew everything. But there was like this whole like Force mute. So it didn't show up around. It wasn't like not on our maps because, you know, a Sith took it off. It was not on our maps. The Force is so crazy there. And then I showed up and I was like bringing my game and I didn't know what was going on. So I had to like actually, I don't know, locate myself in this space and get to know it. And I couldn't assume that I was the one bringing the Force, that the Force was already there. And it was already there in a way that it didn't even make sense on the maps the Jedi had. And so that put an obligation on me to show up and listen. And I had to listen long enough before I could speak. And after I listened long enough, I realized that there was more going on than what I learned when I first showed up and decided to inscribe it on my map. And so I had to have a lesson of humility, and then I could actually figure out how I could be a blessing to these people. But in doing so, they ended up blessing me in ways that transformed me. Mm. And when I read that, when I read it the first time, I was like, oh, this is like the Esther story. This is like what happened when the church, when you get like a mission, and then it's like, oh, how do we encounter the Celtic people? Like, so to me, that like, and it is way easier to talk about that with people if it's freaking Yoda than just to go, by the way, Christian, did you know that the overwhelming majority of places that have come to experience a church in the last couple hundred years can't differentiate it from European colonialism and the expansive nature of the capitalist market? And they would like a takesy back.
Yeah.
Right. Richard Twist, he passed away a few years ago, but Native American theologian would regularly say, like, the white man showed up, gave us said, let us pray, handed us a Bible, and after we bowed our head, they stole everything. Right. And I think that Yoda in that actually learns a different way of encountering difference, where you aren't the vessel that possesses the Force, but the Force led him to a place, so it helped him kind of like take a different posture, not one where, it wasn't like he set aside his deep commitment and relationship to the Force. It's what led him there, but he realized he had as much to learn as he did to share, and that's awesome.
I knew if I brought up that story arc, and it's like a small, what seems like an insignificant small Star Wars story in the grand expanded universe, I knew that if I brought that up to Tripp, because we've gone over this before, that he would like cook. Like I knew he would like expand on this in terms of understanding how we enter the church and spirituality and approaches to the Force and our present reality of how we approach religion in America and around the world. I knew there would be like an unfolding that would happen. So yeah, Tripp, man, I super appreciate that. And yeah, like there's the Star Wars movies and there's the animated stuff, but there's some deep cuts when it comes to the expanding universe, when it comes to the novels and the comics. And there's some good stories that really dive into the nuance of like these approaches to the Force and how that relates to one another and religion that I think is, can really be illuminating. And so I encourage you to do that. So Star Wars, Marvel issue 28, Luke Skywalker reading Obi-Wan's journal and discovering a Yoda story. Jason Aaron, thank you. James, as you heard that.
Plus there's one where all the original clan all rocks lightsabers. Come on.
Yeah, come on. Chewie
like
rocking a lightsaber. Come on.
Yeah, you want to know what happens?
You want to know.
Does he choke slam someone while slicing someone else? Maybe. But you'll have to go look.
You have to go find that stuff. James, like I know you've been part of the animated and some of the expanded universe and even the video games. Like in terms of, I don't know if you've read that comic, but in terms of like these different nuanced approaches to the Force, like what sticks out to you before we get to the bonus question and wrap this thing up? Like hearing Tripp cook like that, like where does that stand with you in terms of where you are and approaches to the Force and religion and as a pastor, youth pastor?
Yeah, I think I'm just sorry, I'm just like lost in my second screen over here with all these Star Wars Marvel comics. There's a lot. I'm excited. Anyways, no, I think part of what I've loved about all the new Star Wars content that's been animated, that's been in video games, I'm thinking like the Star Wars Jedi games with Cal Kestis, if you haven't picked those up, definitely worth a playthrough. It's just, again, what Tripp has brought attention to, just how different folks have interpreted and tried to live with this depth dimension that they have found, and how they've tried to parse that out and what the relationship is there, about different individuals coming into that on their own. So like the Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order game, right? Like you bounce around these planets with like many different cultures who are like grappling with this phenomenon of the Force or whatever they want to call it, and he has to parse his way through it as well when his frame of reference has failed. So I guess there's just a lot to be seen here, and I'm thinking this whole thought of, maybe when you try and capture the sublime in any way, right? Then you kill it.
Yeah.
You can't capture it. It's beyond your limits. And I'm kind of going back to, I was always intrigued as a child with why Qui-Gon Jinn called it the living force, and why he was the only character to do so. And maybe there's something to that. It's alive in a way you can't control or grasp fully, and you just have to respond to it. You have to be in a relationship with it.
Yeah, and that's coming from like ordained Lutheran pastor, youth pastor. And I'm ordained Lutheran pastor, part of institutionalized, organized religion. Tripp is a part of that as well. But Tripp also like curates and facilitates Theology Beer Camp, which is like island of misfit theological toys, or the island of misfit force sensitive folks who haven't quite found their niche in things. But yet even though there's the institution, but there's also folks that there's this reality of people who connect to it. And I love that like Stores has leaned into that. I'm disappointed that the Acolyte, I had problems with that too, but like it's not getting a season 2. I wish it had episode 9 and 10 that wrapped up the story. All one cohesive.
It's not getting season 2?
Yeah.
No, it just got canceled.
Yeah, it got canceled.
Really?
Season 2. Yeah. They should have done 9 and 10 and finished that story with
that Pelagius drop at the end. Yeah, come on.
So I think the fans and fanboys and fandom freaks out about those things, but they had some good ideas about understanding approaches to the Force. I understand people's problems with it and reducing the Jedi to like bad cops, but in terms of these diverse understandings of how to approach the Force, I think is a reality to Star Wars, and also reality to our religion and the Christian faith as well. And so that's why we do this episode, and that's why we've talked for almost an hour and a half in terms of these things, and we could keep going. But like as we wrap up this particular episode, reach out to us. Are there aspects to the Force or understanding of how you applied this to your faith and Christian faith? Then let us know. Come to Theology Beer Camp and hang out with us at the Geek Stage, and let's talk about it on the lawn with a beer or two and do that. So, man, we can keep going. There's no shortage of geeky content, and there'll be Skeleton Crew. There'll be Star Wars movies, different ways to approach the Force and what that means beyond the original trilogy. And man, I can't wait to see what the writers and creatives do with those kind of things. And we'll keep talking about it here at Systematic Geekology. So thanks, folks. Thanks for listening to this. Reach out to us, let us know. And we're going to do a bonus question here. Like there's this whole section in the book of Ephesians to talk about the full armor of God. And they talk about the shield and the breastplate and the sword. We're going to talk about lightsabers and what we think the lightsaber should be attributed to in the full armor of God and the Force. If we were talking about like Force sensitive people, what would the lightsaber, what virtue or part of the Force would it be like actualized out there? So come and be a Patreon, join it. Tripp's a part of it. We're a part of it. Come to Theology Beer Camp, connect with us. James, Tripp, what other things as we wrap up this? What am I forgetting? What are the blind spots I have there that we should let people know?
I don't know if you have blind spots. Well, you're not that old yet, you don't even have glasses.
Yeah. Oh.
But if you think about lightsabers, the main thing, I think people overplay the color parts.
Oh.
Right. And this is a natural tendency of human beings. Is like the moment a part of reality we receive has distinction in it, then we want to categorize it and create a whole system for putting them in. The thing with lightsabers, there are two parts of it I always find fascinating. One, it's a form of Force. It's a way that the Force gets harnessed that forces you to like it's not a weapon that you can use where the one you're attacking's humanity has been distanced from you, be it like a gun or a missile or a Death Star or whatever, right? You have to be in the presence of the person you're dealing with,
up close,
and a community of Force users would put all this energy into training to use something that requires any decision to attack to be that tactile has a kind of wisdom when you know that the universe itself has the potential of like planet destroying zappers, that the more powerful humans have to look the person they're dealing with in the eye. There's that. And the other thing is that it is the lightsabers in and of themselves have their own, like the use of them generates its own discipline of use. And so like to use it, unlike other kinds of weapons in destructive ways, like you have to already be committed to a kind of training that it centers itself on distancing your immediate visceral reactions when using it. To use a lightsaber well, you have to learn to be present and not driven in intense ways by your worst emotions in a moment.
Man,
and that,
yeah, like in terms of the weapons of Star Wars, like lasers and blasters and Death Stars, is from a distance, but like the idea of a lightsaber being up close and you have to look at your opponent in the eyes and be up close with them to relate with them is just a fantastic understanding of whether the other person's lightsaber is blue, green, purple, or red. You still have to like look at them in the eye, and we're going to duel together up close is like a fantastic understanding of how our different approaches to the Force or battle with each other. It's fantastic. So folks, yes.
Right, but that's what happened even in the Acolyte. This is one of the best parts about the Acolyte. The perversion of the lightsaber comes when you're looking another person in the eye and decide you want to kill them out of vengeance. You have all these different colors. There's only one color that says, I looked someone in the eye. I use this intending to kill you for my own means. That's what does it. Right? When you think that you have an omniscient perspective to kill the other person,
right, that
pollutes it. That's what you can't do. All the other things are sitting there, and what you see Jedi in the Acolyte, like, no, like you can't kill an unarmed person. Like there are all these kinds of like things that say the whole way of being a Jedi. If you're Force sensitive, you have this kind of responsibility that you don't take life incidentally. Right. And this is even true about Vader. Yeah. When you look at episode 4, he's not the one that takes the planet out.
Yeah.
He doesn't do it.
Mm-hmm.
It's Tarkin. Tarkin does it. He is running as an ally, but it's not Vader that does it. So like even there you see, like you can see this kind of like criticism towards the industrialization of violence and war. That the moment you just have like the moment you go lightsabers, it's a very different a form of engagement. It in and of itself is like nerfing the destruction value. You know, like if you think of like the way it functions in video games, like right, like you don't have like a lightsaber nuke or. You don't have like a drone saber,
right? Except kyber crystal,
that kind of thing.
Like Andor, like that. They're thinking through that, but yeah, like
but that's precisely not a lightsaber, right? Like they're using kyber crystals, but it like even that like points to the fact that they chose to use a power in a way that doesn't alienate the user from the responsibility of the action.
Sure.
You saw that there was a recent news article on drone pilots, right? So like even like the controls that are used for drones are really look like a PlayStation 2 controller. And there are all these people that they did a longevity study of people that pilot drones. Huge substance abuse, divorce, domestic abuse things, mental breakdowns, all this kind of stuff, right? And so, like, even the fact that they are like basically playing a video game, tracking someone around for a while till they meet all the things, and then bombing them and their kids they just watch play for a week. Like the distance doesn't actually divorce them from the impact of death and violence, because we are always already connected, right? Like that's what the Force is pointing out. And so that you would use kyber crystals, but you use them precisely in the place that the mechanism of responsibility is not alienated from the user. And part of what happens in war, and you can see this from any of the best stuff from World War I on, right? The moment you introduce the machine gun, that becomes one of the major features you see in most fiction or nonfiction, even literature on war after that. I mean, huge in Tolkien going forward. So,
I think, talking about the Force and approaches to the Force, I think we could do a whole nother episode of how like we weaponize religion, weaponize the Force, and a whole nother thing of, and even in Star Wars and all our fandoms, how we weaponize those things, even the sacred texts that we hold dear, how we weaponize them towards others, is a big topic that we can keep going down. Man, so fun. This is why we do systematic ecology. I love hanging out with Tripp and James, like, two of my favorite humans, talking about Star Wars. This is why we do this stuff. So, hop over to Patreon. If you want to know what like Tripp's color of his lightsaber, then hop over there, or James' color of lightsaber and what they attributed to what virtue. Then
how do you categorize yourself, Tripp? Please tell us.
No. That's going to be in the bonus here later on. Then hop over to Patreon and we'll let us know. But thank you guys for listening. Man, it's so fun. We'll keep these series going when it comes to religion or fandom. Again, it's not a bait and switch. It's just like we're real authentic geeks who like to go deeper. We're geekologists. We dive beneath the surface and try to figure out how it goes deeper into how we understand life and our faith and families and relationships. And we're glad that you're a part of this journey with us. So everyone, thank you. And remember, the Force is strong with you and with us, and we'll continue the journey together. May the Force be with you always.
If you'd like to support our show, please consider joining our Patreon, where you get live access to our YouTube exclusives, including our comic book catch-up, manga mustard, drinks with Tejas, and our companion series that we do each year with our annual theme. You can also get exclusive merch, including t-shirts, handbags, a coffee mug, and a long sleeve shirt. We also have available bonus extra questions at the end of most of our podcast episodes. You get access to exclusive Discord channels, discounts on our store, access to any future online D&D campaigns. You get to vote on topics for some of our episodes. You can easily access all of the Patreon content right through Spotify now. So super easy. Go to our Spotify page at the top. It's going to say exclusive content for subscribers. If you're a patron, hit that button. You get all of our bonus content right there on Spotify, right with your regular feed. And of course, you get the satisfaction of knowing you helped a podcast in need. Our overhead includes editing software, marketing equipment, recording software, and a lot more. And there's a lot that goes into keeping the lights on here. And we really appreciate all of our patron subscribers for helping the show happen.
Hey guys, Christian here to talk to you about the ANT Network. That is the Amazon Ministries Podcasting Network. That's what we do for all of us here together. You can follow the whole network in a single feed on Spotify at Amazon Ministries Podcast, or on the network page on Apple Podcasts to just see what we're all doing. And what are we doing? Well, we have plenty of things here. We've got the homily. You love Pastor Will. You want to hear Pastor Will preach. You hear the man doing a homily there. It's amazing. The man does spectacular work for Holy Trinity Lutheran Church in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Then we have the Whole Church podcast. If you want to hear Joshua and TJ talk to different people from around the church who have very different views on how things should go, check it out there. You want to go to My Seminary Life? You want to get some more Brandon Knight in your life? Who doesn't want more of that? Go there, hear about the man, discuss his time at seminary, which is what he used to do. Now he's on other topics, and just head out there for what the rest of the man can do. Hear a lot of good stuff that way. Now you can head over to Let Nothing Move You. That's my podcast where I go through the Bible chapter by chapter, verse by verse. I started with Luke, then I went to Romans, now I'm in Genesis, and I'm moving on from there. It's a good time if you want to hear how I view the Bible, how things should go there. You can do that. You can go to Dummy for Theology, where you can hear Joshua Noel discuss the various theological topics that he has there in an attempt to show every side of the big discussions, leaving you with more questions than answers. If that infuriates you like me, but you still want to listen, head out that way. You can go to the Bible After Hours. We have the foul-mouthed preacher there, and he's going to deliver things that not ready for every ear to hear, but sometimes you need someone to be a little filthy out there just to give a more progressive view of the church, to challenge the status quo of what is happening here. Do you agree with him? Do you not like him? How are you going to know if you don't listen to him? And finally, we have save best for last, the Clydes. Taylor and Elizabeth Clyde. You need some more pangalanging in your life, like all of us do, then head out there, see what's going on in their own life, in their own ministry, so you can hear the devotions and everything going on in their lives. Once again, it's the Anna's Out Ministries Podcasting Network, AMP, and we love you guys. See you next time.